Michael, today I'd like to start with the latest news from Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade, and the latest decision. Now, tell us more about why this is important for the conservatives in America and how the decision of the Supreme Court will actually affect the society and what would be the achievement for the conservatives in this case.
It's an immensely important and consequential step that represents decades, all the way back to the early 1970s, of hard work on behalf of pro-life activists, on behalf of the conservative movement, on behalf of many organizations and individuals. These accomplishments are difficult to obtain. And I think there were many moments between 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which, by the way, essentially protected, just for those who aren't familiar with it, this purported constitutional right to an abortion, which doesn't exist. And the case itself was flawed in an extraordinary number of ways, including misrepresentation of facts, including misinterpretation of laws. And it became the centerpiece of focus. Now, Roe v. Wade, despite what you might hear from pro-abortion activists, doesn't outlaw abortion at all in the United States. And it'll be interesting to see even what the trend is in the coming year and years as it relates to abortion numbers. But it does, as it should be the case under our 10th Amendment clause of state rights, a state issue to begin with. And so each of our 50 states and the District of Columbia will now have the right to determine any real level of position that they so choose to develop on it, anywhere from these full-blown, almost up to the moment of pregnancy abortions that New York and California have, and a few other states, Illinois, have tried to embrace and are embracing, and more conservative leaning and pro-life states will put reasonable restrictions on it. Now, it's important, then the healthcare dimension of it is also important. Abortion is not healthcare, and the left has tried to depict it this way for a long time. I can recall, very specifically, working in the Senate during a floor debate on this issue, and being asked to come up with issues or examples where absent abortion, you would have endangerment of the mother. These are exceedingly rare cases. They're almost impossible to find in a lot of ways. Abortion in the United States, by and large, is almost always just a matter of convenience and thoughtlessness and recklessness, and it's taken tens of millions of unborn lives that who knows what genius and greatness never emerged in the form of human life. The final point is that in a moment of really some despair and fear and pessimism in some respects, it breathes new life into, I think, the American people, that all of this work that so many of us have committed ourselves to, not just on this, but on every issue of concern to the country, has real tangible impact. And for me, it's kind of a liberating moment, because when I came out and endorsed Donald Trump June 16th, 2015, and I did so, as I still am, a movement conservative Republican, and have been for my life. Many of my colleagues, many of whom I held in the highest of esteem, jumped all over me on a whole range of concerns they have with Trump. But one of the loudest position they had was that you've got to be kidding me that you think Trump is going to keep these commitments to the pro-life community. I said, no, I'm close enough to this that I believe he will. I believe he will keep these commitments. and obviously the appointments, the SCOTUS appointments to the court were decisive in the Dobbs ruling. We wouldn't have had it without that. But he was also, as I observed since yesterday, the first president to ever show up and speak at the March for Life, this large annual event, usually held in the middle of winter in January. Sometimes, tens of thousands, up to 100,000, as many people would come. The media would completely ignore it in the United States, like it never even occurred. And I watched this and sometimes participated in it. But I would always say I really admired the commitment that these people brought year after year to come and to pray and to organize and to peacefully call for the protection of unborn life. And then finally in 2020, Trump becomes the first president since Roe v. Wade in 1973 to actually show up and speak. Even Reagan, who was pro-life, who appointed and attempted to appoint pro-life judges, and by that I mean those who felt that Roe was unconstitutional. They were constitutionalists, I guess is the better way to word it. I think even here, these are not individuals who are taking a position on abortion. They've taken an issue on, does the federal government have the legal authority to do what they did in Roe? And by the way, I read most of the majority opinion since it was issued. It's a beautiful piece of writing. You don't see writing that has the intellectual depth and persuasiveness too commonly in the modern era that I see in that. So, and of course, as you know, the opinion and the fact that it was forthcoming was illegally leaked, almost certainly by a far left Supreme Court, probably a clerk. I don't, these are guarded documents. They're not broadly accessible, so it probably had to be. And I really believe very strongly in a time when there's lots of questions about what our federal, both Justice Department and FBI are doing, where the priorities lie, that we get to the core of that, because that was fundamentally illegal. And then, of course, we had, for the first time, I believe, I can't think of another time this happened, a legitimate attempt to murder a Supreme Court justice with this, and we're hearing almost nothing about that either. So this man flies from California after the leak. The leak probably almost certainly inspires the effort, and then finally, very disappointing is that this Justice Department allowed, and this and law enforcement allowed another federal violation in allowing the intimidation and protest outside of these justices' residential homes, which is not permitted under federal statute. No enforcement whatsoever. And in fact, Jen Psaki, when she was press secretary, wouldn't even verbally condemn or dissuade it.
Yeah, I heard
so it's a great victory, and now left feels that this is going to end up somehow being a defining issue for them. But the final point on this is that the country has moved more in a pro-life direction over the last 20, 30 years, not in a marked way, but in a notable way. And a lot of it's been due to the medical technology of sonograms and a greater recognition that seeing preborn life, seeing it move in the womb, as you can see with this technology, and also then with an appreciation of what an abortion actually is, what physically is done in the way of extracting preborn life is horrific, indefensible, and disgusting. And this education and broader understanding, I think, has been one the Americans have come around to. And so we're going to get a lot of probably, violence and rage expressed over it, but this will now go back to the states, and they want to make it an issue in November. And we got a lot of issues we're going to face in November.
Yeah.
We're going to face the border. We're going to face Biden's inflation. We're going to face Biden's failure in national security and foreign affairs. I mean, almost every.
So these are the questions that I actually want to ask.
But I welcome that, because I believe there once may have been a time of defense of preborn life was a difficult political sell. I don't believe it is any longer. It's, we're now talking about, and in fact, it becomes an easier debate, because now you're talking about a state being able to take measured results, measured steps as it relates to what duration in the pregnancy it's permissible, and what the terms are, and does there need to be any justifying clinical or other justification for this. And it's a tragedy, because we have so many Americans looking to adopt, children, that to just be killing them in the womb with such reckless abandon is been outrageous to me and to many others. So it's a big victory. And in fact, it occurred to me yesterday just how much work went into it, and by so many people, and over such a long period of time.
Excellent. So Michael, how do you see and describe the political atmosphere now in the US prior to the midterm election of the House and the Senate?
Well, I start with the fact that in 2009, if you go back January 2009, Obama comes in, the Democrats control the House, the Senate. The media are just in love with him for reasons that weren't really based on any of his. He hadn't really had a whole bunch of accomplishments at that point, but they were just, look at the contrast and say how they treated him versus Trump is glaring. Academia completely in the hands of the left. Every major institution really in the hands of the left. More so today than it was then, but we had no reason for real optimism. And of course, the Tea Party movement organizes in February 2009, and we demonstrate that you can bring, that we brought that government to a halt in the 2010 off-year election with 63 House victories, the most since the 19th century. And I am hopeful, and then of course we took the Senate in 2014, which blocked some of his more radical judicial nominees. Movement also gave rise to some of the bigger names in our movement in the Senate, just Rubio and Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Rand Paul. I think all four of those guys would be forthright in telling you that they wouldn't be U.S. senators today without the Tea Party movement. And then we had a caucus, and we put the brakes on the agenda that's now being implemented. It would have been implemented back then, and they couldn't get it done. I think in November, and this is important to realize because it's just going to change everything. While we continue to have major concerns about election integrity and election fraud, and there haven't been the steps taken really over the last 2 years of the magnitude that I would have liked to have seen, because we have opposition to it, frankly, on the state level, which is a curious thing to me. What would motivate someone not to want to make elections more secure? But we're headed toward major victories absent some sort of, extraordinary sense of illegality. And, I am concerned about, does another pandemic sort of magically appear that requires mail-in ballots? These mail-in ballots are the source, and were the source in 2020 of most of the concerns that ended up, yes, along with the completely unenforced restructuring of state election laws, which are empowered to state legislatures. State legislatures were completely cut out of this process, which was a concern a lot of us had with Zuckerberg's $300 million plus support for these boxes. State legislature needs to authorize that, never did. To me, that's that's criminality. I mean, we've seen people who've been prosecuted because they bundled a few campaign contributions of a few $1,000s. This had measurable effect, and it was, of course, then these boxes were put into conveniently, the most heavily intense blue Democrat region. So, but the point is that the bottom is falling out of this presidency. I mean, the numbers are indisputable. The independent support he has, which is really a good measurement, the one I try to look the most at, his support level among independents is now in the 20s. The base of enthusiasm among Republican voters and independents opposed to Biden is extraordinary, and Democrats, who you almost have to feel a little sympathetic with or empathetic with. I mean, this is indefensible. You can't, unlike a lot of past elections where things were not going well, but you had at least one or two successes you could point to, and people had a general sense that their life would, I mean, no American is going to go to vote in November feeling that they're better off in November 22 than they were, say, in 2019. Trump had this country humming on all cylinders in that third year pre-pandemic, and the American people remember that.
Yeah,
and we'll do it again. And then here's the next point: once we take the House and the Senate, I believe, in what I hope will be numbers that even exceed the Tea Party revolution, as big of a stretch as that would be. We're going to hold this government accountable, and they know it. They know it full well. It's why they're acting so aggressively toward political opponents and to leadership. It's why this January 6th commission, which no one is paying any attention to because it's completely almost a stage show. I mean, to be questioning witnesses, you don't have the ability to call our own witnesses. We don't have the ability to subpoena documents. We don't have the ability to bring out facts that we know to be true.
Yeah.
And we don't have and we have no counsel. I mean, and we have there's not a Republican on there. There are Republicans who have an R behind their name on it, but realize that not one person on there was appointed by Republican leadership for the first time in the history of the Congress. So it's a sham, and it's part of their agenda to try to, knowing that they're losing politically in a big way, because the people are organizing against them and have been organized against them really since the Tea Party movement. They're at a loss as to what to do. They need something drastic, and they're trying to depict 80 million plus MAGA and really centrist voters as being extremists or terrorists, and of course the one act of legitimate terror and insurrection that I just cited in the case of the murder attempt against a Supreme Court justice. It's almost like you wouldn't know that happened if you weren't glued into this. There's no media coverage of it, no scrutiny of it. Yeah. We have no information really on who the guy was. So it's, the way I've worded this, it's all projectionism with a psychological term, which is that you take the things that you're consciously doing in a negative or destructive way, and you accuse others of doing these exact same things. This has been going on since 2015 or 16 with them. And it was emblematic in the Russia probe, where Trump did nothing wrong, and their dossier and their funding of it and their lying about it was everything that was wrong.
Yeah. So how do you see the results would be for this upcoming election, and how would the parameters like energy crisis at the moment, food crisis, and other parameters contribute to the people's final decision on the ballot boxes?
Everyone, I think, who's been engaged in this long enough has come to conclusions about how to represent things. I've always held the belief that forthright honesty with the American people about the state of affairs is the most effective approach for the advancement of the U.S. It's in our best interest as a country to do that and to have people in the public sphere who are committed to it. And then also, I think it's probably politically beneficial. So, for me to say, look, we're going to take the House, and in 90 days, there'll be no inflationary pressures. We'll have, restored, the government of Afghanistan, be back in Bagram. We'll have, neutralized the CCP's, multi-year war now internally declared war against the United States, where they're making extraordinary progress. And we'll have stripped out the deep state that's been, kind of the essential core of the problem in our policy development would be overstated. It's going to take a long time for us to right the ship. And my message, which I'm not hearing from many on our side, is we have to take some responsibility for that too. We didn't lose these institutions, and we didn't experience these setbacks in a week or 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. This has been 20 years easily of a movement on our side that I don't believe is operating with the magnitude of seriousness, the magnitude of collaboration, the magnitude of strategy and sophistication that's required given what we're up against. We're up against one of the most sophisticated, ruthless, and tactically efficient political movements in the history of politics, period, in the world. And how else would you explain to this World Economic Forum? You get this, ancient guy nobody's heard of, and all of a sudden we have companies of the whole world saying, yeah, we're going to restructure the way we do business, and when this whole, focusing on revenue and profits, that should be the role of a company. I mean, it's extraordinary to me, just across field, how much progress they've made with people who you never would have thought would buy into this agenda. But it's a snowball effect, and that's the essence of how politics and the political culture often rolls, is that there's not, sadly, a lot of boldness. There's not a lot of understanding, really, of the magnitude of the effort to bring this country down, how far along it is, how deep it goes. And so many people just don't want to ruffle feathers. If that's the approach we take as a country, we do, by the way, we will be the first generation of Americans since, the first shots of the American Revolution in 1775 to not have lived up to our challenge. If we take that approach will fail, and we will lose this country. I don't say that to scare people. I don't say that to overstate it. I'm saying it factually, and I've never seen an array of forces so strongly aligned against this country, internally and externally, and I have never seen our side so apparently not, just really not yet rising to the moment. But like I said on the Dobbs case, which wasn't, sure, it was one ruling, and a few SCOTUS judges, but none of that would ever occurred were it not for the work that were done diligently by the American people over decades. So we've shown, you see there's an example, I mentioned the Tea Party example, I could give you other examples, but we have the capability to turn this all around. But it starts with a recognition that no one can look at the last 20 years of the conservative movement and say, in the United States, or let's not even call it the conservative movement, the centrist, nationalist, patriotic movement, and say that we've been succeeding or even holding our own. We're losing, and we're losing because of tactics, strategy, are reflective of, frankly, a leadership crisis, and they're reflective of tactical missteps and too many people working in isolation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So looking into the outcome of the election, I want to know what kind of changes we might come across with in regards to China, Russia, and the cleric regime in Iran.
Well, we will impeach Joe Biden. That probably is the first step of the new Congress. I'm not looking to disclose all the details of tactics, but this has gotten out, and so on the border and on Afghanistan, there's no doubt they rise, in my judgment, to high crime and misdemeanor. There's no doubt in my mind either that they're going to have overwhelming support. And that in that process, we're going to have discovery of facts, some of which I know, some of which our side already knows, but which really need to be more formally presented, in that process, that will be even more enlightening to the American people about the magnitude of destruction this administration has been proactively doing. And then on the issue of Iran and China, the position of the Republican Party, formally at least, we have some issues in our own party too sometimes, and some, but these are hostile enemy forces. They need to be isolated. We need to have very upgraded and threat-specific defense systems against both of them that are probably currently deficient. But I want to be fair. They have deficient systems too. We're able to turn this around. This isn't hopeless. We need to make clear and have a understandable strategic strategy that makes it very clear, both rhetorically and in a practical defense way, that the independence of and standalone sovereignty of Taiwan will not be permitted to be threatened. And as far as Iran goes, Iran, a regime that fails in just about everything except its militancy and its atrocious and ruthless, completely immoral, almost, not almost evil approach in extinguishing perceived, and I say perceived, opponents. Many of them are not even really regime opponents, but people that deviated from the way they want to see things done. Is that we need to pick up the defense of human rights in both these countries. I'm not asking American people to restructure the priorities. America still comes first. But a strong America in the world is a strong America because we have the economic, political, and the credibility that is attached to being able to speak on these issues. And that's why, if you go back to the Anchorage meeting with Tiger Yang and that atrocious, disrespectful treatment of our Secretary of State Blinken and others, which, by the way, if I had been involved, that would have been the end of that meeting. We would have put the CCP back on airplanes and sent them out of our country. You don't come into the United States or anywhere and speak, even though I obviously am not a Democrat and I'm not part of this administration. Let me defend them. They are senior level officials in the United States government, and you don't come over here as a genocidal regime in the case of China. Not Michael John's opinion, though I've known about it since 15 or so. This is a stated conclusion of the United States government under the Trump administration, which, by the way, the Biden administration could have reversed and did not reverse because it's not reversible. They're engaged in genocidal tactics. So that needs focus and attention. And I believe Afghanistan, which you didn't mention, but is so closely attached in so many ways to both of these crises,
Yes.
in so many different ways, is going to require focus and attention. And so these are priorities that I'm focused on, and you know, so, and the message has to go out to the people of China, right? I mean, you have 1.4 billion, and how many are members of China's Communist Party? I think it's like 95 million, but that's even misleading because it really comes down to about 1,000 ultimately within the body of governing organizations that have even a little bit of influence. And then even within that, the without getting into too much of the technical functionality of China's Communist Party, it's 5 to 11 people who run the show completely. You know, so when you look at this lockdown that they just had, in Shanghai, right, which was like several hundred million people, all net at some point, were under lockdown because Xi Jinping wanted to exert that level of control. People were starved, people died as a result of it.
Jumped out of the apartments.
Yeah, people jumped. Yeah, that's right. They jumped, literally committed suicide. It was, and of course, that just conveniently happens to be the base of some of the much internal opposition that Xi Jinping faces within the regime. You know, it's a paradox on China. Just a final point that Xi Jinping, you know, when he back in 2018 sought and obtained at that moment the ability to extend beyond 2 terms his leadership and to be bestowed this position of president for life. Yeah, on the surface you might say, wow, that's really helpful to Xi Jinping and what broad support he must have. But for anyone who is drawn into this party structure that has aspirations of ascending, it's not inherently great news. And of course, he's launched this anti-corruption campaign simultaneously that's had nothing to do with corruption and everything to do just with exterminating political opponents and all of the ethnic-based ongoing atrocities, human rights violations, and genocide, Tibetans, Hong Kong, the violation of the Hong Kong Agreement, obviously. You go through all of those provinces and say pretty safely, I believe, that if you had a referendum in them, that China's Communist Party could not win a referendum in even one of those provinces. That's a real it's a shocking, pretty astounding.
This is actually the question which I want to ask now. What is the climate? What is the political climate in China right before the 20th National Congress of CCP, which is coming up? How do you see that?
I believe that the internal opposition outside of the party, directed toward the party, within the party, and with some bold statements that have been made by insiders within the party, are suggestive of the fact that there's a lot of internal deliberation and concern. And because really, Xi Jinping is the strongest Chinese leader since Mao. And he's breaking a lot of the historical precedents that had existed in defining this cult of personality, in exterminating and maliciously treating those with even modest disagreements internally. And simultaneously, if you look, because the deal in China has always been basically this, and I'm just in the interest of time to simplify, here's been the deal. It's been we're going to afford the middle class of China reasonable standard of living that they can survive. In exchange for that, we're going to take all of your freedoms and liberties. You'll have nothing. And that dynamic, which is unappealing as that might be to those outside of China, has been one that at least has kept stability. But once you get to a point where that economy is not delivering for those people, as it hasn't been, and it's only delivered because of what? Because they've stolen, lied, cheated, IP theft, selling human organs, fentanyl sales. We describe it as a transnational criminal organization that is employing mafia-like tactics with the instruments of governmental power. That's what we're facing, and that's what we're confronting. And the American people need to be educated on that. Then we get a lot of questions like, well, we don't want the U.S. to go to war with China. No, we're into year 3 or 4 of a proactive war against the United States by the CCP that includes every aspect of war except kinetic warfare. Mm. So when you go down the list of the magnitude of initiatives that they have taken to destabilize, harm, neutralize, and diminish our influence in the world, it's definable, at least in a technical national security military way, as being warfare, which is tough to understand when we're accustomed to thinking of war as what you might see on TV and whatnot. And that kinetic component, of course, is still entirely conceivable, and it's come close. They've had troops down on the border of India. They have, they moved in and suffocated, and people have disappeared all over Hong Kong. They have a dark prison system in China that is vastly greater than anyone realizes, where people just disappear. And that includes, by the way, some of the brave, bold Chinese patriots who tried to forewarn us about the COVID pandemic and the fact that the CCP was not being forthcoming to it. From kids who shot YouTube videos to clinicians who treated patients, those who spoke out about it have disappeared.
The doctor, yes, I remember the video.
But yeah, the individual you're probably referring to mysteriously died of the disease in a hospital in what was an immensely preventable case of death. But an extraordinary number of individuals just routinely disappearing. And in the United States, what's called in foreign policy national security elite capture, which means, and I've been following this since the 80s because I didn't like the direction of it then. But we have had an extraordinary number of senior government officials and those within kind of what I would say is the broader influential political culture of our country who have been drawn in by the CCP. And have either been recipients of extraordinary financial benefits and rewards as a result of those relationships, or have been compromised with activities or otherwise that are discovered that they hold over their heads. They have mastered this process as well as any regime in the history of our country, any enemy in the history of our country, to the point where this kinetic warfare is not necessarily ever going to be needed, where we have individuals doing the bidding of their agenda internally. So, you're not going to hear any competent explanation as to why we have proactively ordered this border to be open, why we're facilitating, why we've deployed military assets all the way down throughout Central America, to actually facilitate the flow of illegals, assist the flow of illegals. you're not going to hear any competent explanation about why we literally gave no advance notice at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan to our departure there, which was the first in a series of steps that was designed to hand the regime to the Taliban and to leave them with enough sufficient military weaponry and this very strategically located air base in there. And by the way, you know who's in Bagram now is the CCP.
Yeah.
And you know, so the and then Iran, you know, the people of Iran, when I look back at the street protests that existed only a few years ago, you know that it's a combustible situation with a regime that has no domestic support basis. These guys will pay, their loyalists are people that are part of their payoff system that are drawn in, but they can't pay everyone off. And that leaves the vast majority of citizens and of these countries. In the case of China, you know, provinces really, because they don't have much in common with Beijing, much like the case was in the Soviet Union, very open, I think, to turning on them when it looks like they have even a reasonable prospect of success. And you know, when you look at the extraordinary commitments and the risk and danger that so many opponents of these regimes have taken, it should be enlightening to Americans, because it tells you how bad the totalitarian nature of these regimes really is. That so many individuals would be more than willing to put their lives on the line to change the regime. So the key here too is, like the key to the United States, strategy, it's collaboration.
Yes.
I'd like to see more unity in opposition forces. We don't have to agree on everything, but you know, agree at least on working together to change the regime and to establish governments that are respectful of human rights and are representative of the will of the people of those countries, and are not engaged in harboring terrorist forces or being opponents of the United States. True. And I think they have a chance. These are not strong regimes, though the Biden administration is in fact doing much of what they can do to strengthen them. You know, by increasing our dependency on them, by stumbling over themselves to get back into this completely misguided and flawed Iran agreement. Right. It's problematic. And then the final point is UAE and Saudi Arabia. Yep. Here's my message there. My message to them, my message on UAE and Saudi Arabia has always been, we really value both of these countries as friends and allies within the region. And we've done a lot for them, and they've done some things for us too. And I think they look at this Biden administration for the first, and I'm seeing for the first time, that they have concerns about the direction of the United States. And we're not getting right now the level of cooperation that I think is important given the magnitude of what's going on with Iran and China in the region. But here's the point. This administration ends in a few short months. And we being, I think, foreign policy experts within the Republican Party who will exert influence in the direction of foreign policy, are not enemies of the UAE or Saudi Arabia. We want to see those relationships strengthened. We want to work with them, not against them. And the Iran regime, you know, is got to be isolated. And I hope the people of Iran will ultimately force change in that country. And meanwhile, the regional terrorist support needs to end, and the nuclear weapons development program that's so far along needs to end. And by the way, it will end. We will not allow the development of a nuclear weapons program in Iran. I promise you that. And we will do everything possible to end the destabilization of the region with all the needless death and terrorist activities that are exclusively funded by the Islamic regime.
Yeah. Yeah. So getting back one more time to China, there's a kind of a rivalry between Chairman Xi Jinping and the Premier Li Keqiang in terms of different COVID policy. One is trying to emphasize on zero COVID policy, the other one on coexistence policy, and all the effects of these two policies on the economy of the China implosion, sinking economy, stuff like that. So how do you see this rivalry? Is it a real thing, or is it just a superficial thing that they're putting a show for people just to say that, yeah, there are people? Yeah, how do you analyze it?
It's a good question, because I was in one during the Cold War when we would hear these Sovietologists who were routinely wrong, by the way, on their predictions and projections. I can remember even in the late 80s, when I said, look, I believe the Soviet Union was in because of the success I saw that we were having in the Reagan doctrine, being out in the field, not from Washington, D.C., but being out in the fields and jungles with these guys, watching the magnitude of resistance that was emerging. If you came back to DC and presented that thesis that some of these purportedly prestigious institutions that are routinely turned to as being experts, they found that laughable. And yet that, of course, is exactly what happened. And no one ever apologizes in this profession, so they never say, hey, Michael Johns, you got that right, or the conservatives got that right. They just keep moving on and going on to their next wrong prediction. But I believe, unlike the Soviet Union, which they always said there were internal moderating forces, and we were somehow inflaming those moderate forces with our assertiveness, which was all just a mechanism to get us to oppose basically the proactive steps that Reagan took with our support that ultimately led to our victory in the Cold War. In the case of China, I do think that there is legitimate opposition to Xi Jinping internally. You see it in Jiang Zemin, 95 years old about now, I think. But his statements, you see it in this leadership at the primary CCP university. This is the CCP university saying that Xi Jinping is destructive and bad for the country. These are the people that are educating the elite CCP, the next generation of elite CCP leaders, who's, I guess, been dismissed. But you're seeing, to the extent you can within a totalitarian society like that, all the signs of internal friction. And it's because I guess it'll be November. They haven't announced the date. I'm sure they know the date. They don't want us to know the date, but we know more than they think we know about what's going on with all this. And you're going to have this important consideration really on and some major decisions made. This Congress only meets every 5 years, and I think this is the 20th in the history since the 1949 revolution, only 20 of them that they've had. So it is, there's either going to be an affirmation of support for Xi Jinping in perpetuity, which I don't think will end the opposition, by the way, or there'll be legitimate concerns and questions raised, and that in turn might spiral into even broader levels of internal opposition. And you have the PLA and where they stand, the military, obviously, and this vast intelligence network, and a lot of power sources in China, because keeping 1.4 billion people down takes a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of institutions and people. The problem is that it attracts people that gravitate only to power. And that in turn creates internal divisions, the likes of which I think we're seeing some of. And I don't want to make too much out of it. Xi Jinping's the leader of China right now. He's driving these genocidal and threatening tactics. He's enhanced, not pulled back on his hostilities with the West. And if you go through the list of categories of warfare, They, like I said, they've been engaged in just about every one of them except the kinetic war, and they've made it clear. I mean, look at the, I didn't mention this, but look at the Singapore meeting. I mean, again, like with Tiger Yang, they're treating us disrespectfully in a transparently open and blatant way. This is the way communist regimes treat those who they know are compromised or weak. You look at this quote from Tiger Yang, which I happen to have had here somewhere as I was using it, which is very interestingly worded, because you and I, we won't describe it this way, but they talked about how in confronting Blinken that the United States does not have the strength to be able to have credible opposition or concerns about anything happening in China. The United States does not have the qualifications to say that it wants to speak from strength. The qualifications that it wants to speak from strength. So this is a message they're trying to project to the world. And this is what I would encourage, like UAE and Saudi Arabia, dismiss it completely. They're going to burn these countries with any promises they make, just like they did to Hong Kong. You do not underestimate or diminish the power of the United States of America. I know there's conflicting issues that might look intriguing to enemies of our nation abroad. And I know that we have our weaknesses. And you look at the closure of that Houston consulate, you know, and I don't know if you've seen the video of it, but you know, when Trump ordered that the CCP to close that Houston consulate, they had, you know, just about everybody in that embassy out in the back parking lot with you know, burning, just aggressively burning documents, because they were engaged and are engaged in doing some very malicious, illegal, threatening, detrimental things in this country. The magnitude of their surveillance alone is extraordinary. But they shouldn't, I think they also suffer from a level of overconfidence. They think they know more than they do. And the things that they believe very strongly about people and individuals in this country may or may not be accurate. Let me just put that out for their consideration.
Right. So now let's look into this. America is coming out of the midterm election. China is coming out of its own election. Now we have post.
Well, it's not call it an election, right? I mean, it's like I mean, you can't, there's no democracy involved.
True. So let's say that after November, after 2022, when America is out post-election, how is going to be the relation between China and America? Would it actually would the heat escalate to another level, or
we're not? Yeah, I don't think we're not seeking and will not seek to escalate, and have not proactively sought to escalate any engagement or opposition to the regime. Our responses have been purely reactive and responsive. So much of it lies with what their behavior, you know, actually ends up being. You know, to be clear, they're behind COVID, which they manufactured in Wuhan, which they knew represented a threat to the world, that they instructed the World Health Organization to lie to the world about. Those are documentable facts. That it was a PLA military lab. This was not some biotechnology, you know, this wasn't the Biogen of China involved in trying to discover, you know, the next therapies of cures. Gain of function research is a component of biological warfare. And it's the only reason you would intensify these viral entities. How it was released, we know more about than they think we know. Who was involved in ordering and directing much of that, we know more about than they think we know. They need to be held accountable for that. Trillions of dollars of damage to the world economy, millions dead from it, and then all the associated problems that arose, including mental health crises and, you know.
But to hold them accountable, there should be a kind of a unity in the world that will actually tell to CCP and actually act in a way to hold them accountable. How would that mechanism?
Yeah, I want to be clear about that. We're because one of their lies that they try to spread all over the world is we act arrogantly and unilaterally, and it's just the opposite. And you look at the history of American foreign policy, we have sacrificed and spilled blood for the cause of countries that we had, you know, that for the purposes of a broader sense of humanitarian decency and to stop the ascent of totalitarianism in those regions. We've been the most philanthropic country in the history of the world. They have been the most murderous, to my knowledge, with numbers that, you know, are in the 70, 80, 90 million, some believe, range of innocents who've been killed since Mao, or were killed since Mao by this regime. Is this a struggle of good versus evil? It is exactly that. We're not at 1984, 85, like it was in the Cold War. We're like at 1980. The American people are awakening to it. And they're awakening also, I think, to the reality that Xi Jinping signed off on Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that he launched cyber attacks against the defense infrastructure in Kiev and elsewhere to soften up the system in preparation for that. He dictated the dates of the invasion because he didn't want it to conflict with his Winter Olympics in Beijing. And obviously, go look at it, the easiest vote in the history of the United Nations, a symbolic vote of condemnation for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, they abstained on. They could not. So this is the regime that's telling the rest of the world that they're somehow a force of leadership for stability, decency, you know, and individual, you know, representation and even freedom. It's so absurd. Here's the easiest vote that they could have cast would have been to say that Russia invasion of Ukraine deserved condemnation in the UN and a symbolic call for Putin to move his forces out. But just the opposite. Even more recently, they announced obviously the boundless, limitless agreement between the two of them. You're going to see more, not less, commercial relationships between Putin and Xi Jinping. They're going to burn Putin just like they burn everybody else they've dealt with, and I don't know how he's going to handle that. But it'll be, but there's no separation there at all. They're trying to create and have created through the Belt and Road Initiative mostly this scandalous, again, almost mob-like development project that they have, where they put these countries into leveraged, secured debt, and then seize assets when they default, as they've done in Sri Lanka, as they've done in Djibouti, as they've done in other countries around the world. This thing needs to be stopped. By the way, it has nothing to do with economic development. It is an elaborate plan that China has to monopolize key trade routes and to control the logistics, the associated logistics of the transport of all vital food, consumer items, etc., so that it further enhances their geopolitical agenda of really being the global force in the world. So it needs to be stopped. And the way to stop it is exactly what you said, is that every country of the world needs to awaken to the reality that, and some of it's difficult because they go in and the deal that they love to see countries that are suffering. They think they're susceptible to entering into these kind of bad deals, and they love to see corrupt regimes because they don't need any support from the people. They go in, they cut these deals, and that's a sad reality of that you have in a lot of examples of successive administrations in these countries. They're having to deal with these debt obligations that no sensible government would have taken on to begin with, but corrupt predecessors did.
Yeah.
And so there is, I think, need to be we have formalized alliances, obviously, but countries that are important, you know, and I'm going to leave some out, and I don't mean to, but you know, I want to see South Korea, Japan. I want to see India, maybe just a hugely underrated friend that we need to be hand in glove, working with hand in glove on this. I want to see Australia, the Philippines, and Europe's got to awaken to what we're up against too. I mean, we're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine right now, while we're also simultaneously sending about just as much to Russia because of Europe's unwillingness to break their energy ties with Russia, which we tried to persuade them to do during the Trump administration. Yes. And you know, so that's a chaotic policy. We're funding the very war that we're now saying we urgently need to fund opposition to. And quite honestly, some of the inflammatory rhetoric regarding Ukraine previously, I'm not dismissing anything, but what Putin did is reprehensible. And this is the way Russia's always fought, the brutal. They just, you know, this was, you know, they're turning, you know, some of these cities look like Dresden. And I don't know how that whole thing ends, but the fact that they've got China behind them is very concerning to me. And China's got to be condemned, and there needs to be brought in. We need to pick up the game on China. And I see there are emerging organizations, not just in the United States, but around the world of you know, individuals and entities that I really hold in high regard who follow this. And we know we have an appreciation of the facts, but they need to be now boiled down and communicated so that the American people can appreciate that we have some very, very difficult decisions ahead of us, and we're doing all the wrong things. You know, I mean, our Fed policy is misguided, our fiscal policy is misguided. This border is going to continue to snowball in ways that are detrimental across the board, and we've allowed Afghanistan to be turned into a terrorist super state, now directed by the CCP.
Yes, exactly. Great interview, Michael. Thank you very much. And my plan would be to prepare the Farsi translation as well for this interview and put it as a part of a YouTube program and other platforms that I have. So thank you again for your time. And it was a great interview, and it was a great pleasure for me to have an interview with you.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers. See you again. Thank you. Bye.